Today's discussion will be presented in three sections as we are recording this for broadcast on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Feel free to post questions and comments during the session, and we'll try to get them answered online. We are pleased to welcome our moderator, Tom Temin, host of Federal Drive on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Let me turn over the reins to Tom to begin today's discussion.
Welcome and thanks for joining us. Cloud computing, cloud brokerage, and data security issues are coming together as the federal government gets deeper into the cloud era. FedRAMP is still driving federal cloud security standards, and agencies are looking primarily for trusted cloud platforms. We're going to explore the next generation of cloud questions now that the basics are mostly out of the way and agencies are actually going to the cloud. Our guests today are Gary Bartlett. He's the Chief Information Officer of the Postal Service Office of Inspector General. Melinda Rogers is the Chief Information Security Officer at the Justice Department. Steve Hernandez is the Chief Information Security Officer for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Inspector General's Office. And Mark Williams is the Chief Security Officer at Microsoft Federal. Great to have you all on our show today. And let's start with FedRAMP, because FedRAMP is the way that cloud providers are certified. What I'd like to get from our government guests is an idea of how you actually, in practical matter, go about making sure that the cloud services providers you choose are, in fact, kosher by FedRAMP standards. And maybe give us an idea of where you are in the cloud now with respect to what applications. So, Steve, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So the fundamental baseline that we're all working with is FedRAMP, and we have to look at that as just a baseline of operations. Okay, FedRAMP brings us up to a kind of a moral minimum, if it were, in terms of information security. What's important to note, though, is that FedRAMP is a one-size-fits-all program, and so a moderate FedRAMP system is going to be the same across any government customer. As a government customer, we have to take that next step and say, as an Inspector General law enforcement agency, what are the additional controls we need to have in place, and what are the additional requirements that we need to, say, fine-tune a specific control, such as maybe records retention for our particular application. And that's going to vary from agency to agency. Once a cloud provider's actually gone through and implemented that level of control, we have a responsibility to come in and check the third-party assessment organization's work, the 3PAO, which means we're going to have a team of IV&V folks, independent verification and validation folks, that are going to go through that package and say, yeah, you know what, they did a great job. They covered everything that we need for the agency, and we're good to go. There's some minimal risks that we'll need to discuss. Or, you know what, we need these areas that weren't covered in the FedRAMP baseline. We need to go back to that cloud provider and see if they can shore that up and make that happen.
And within the FedRAMP baseline, are there variables? In other words, can you get a 3 out of 5 on this part of FedRAMP and a 4 out of 5 on that part?
It's actually pretty stringent. GSA, especially if you're going for what's called the JAB authorization, which is the provisional ATO, they're pretty stringent. You can't miss much.
Okay, and just give us an idea of where you stand in cloud implementation. What's your state of the art these days?
Sure. So we're heavy into government cloud right now. We use a government cloud provider for the majority of our data center services, and then email as a service, we're using a commercial provider. And so we kind of have a mix, and it's kind of fun to compare the two between what the government's doing in the cloud services space and then also the private sector.
Okay, we'll get into that more as we go. And Melinda, at Justice Department, what's your process?
Very similar to what Steve was just describing. FedRAMP is a process that could be shared and leveraged across the federal government, and that's the beauty of the FedRAMP process. You do it once and use it multiple times. At the end of the day, there are idiosyncrasies that may be unique to each department or each type of systems that we have to consider, but ultimately the objective is to leverage and extract efficiency out of this process.
So FedRAMP might be conferred on various cloud providers, but that doesn't mean that you'll use that alone in your final choice.
Correct. Ultimately, it is about the baseline, right? So FedRAMP is based on the NIST security control requirements. It establishes that baseline, actually, plus a handful of additional controls that are specific to cloud service providers, because ultimately, we, the government, we're outsourcing either a service or we're putting our data out into the cloud. So we need to make sure that the proper safeguards are in place to protect that information.
So there's a little bit of mission specificity to all of this.
Slightly, yeah. I mean, we're doing the best we can in terms of standardizing this product, if you will, with some local customization.
Okay. And at Postal Service, Gary?
So
or
same
at least
thing.
the IG at
Right,
Postal
at the IG.
Service.
So same thing as Melinda mentioned, that that's your baseline. That's kind of your price of entry. So so you go to contract something. The very first question you state is, must be FedRAMP certified. Are you? Yes or no? And if the answer is no, you're done. It's one of those deals where if you don't pass the minimum price of entry, there's no reason to continue to have a conversation about it. Then once you get past that, like has been mentioned before, you still have some unique things. You may have law enforcement data. You may have records retention policies that need to be met that aren't necessarily baked into FedRAMP proper. There may be some things that are some minimals for those things, or it may not necessarily be a part of FedRAMP, depending on what some of your own mission requirements are. So that's where you really start the conversation. But the nice thing is you're not starting a conversation with a vendor from square zero. You're at square 32 when you start that conversation. And that's really what FedRAMP brings to the table for you.
So as Steve put it, the moral minimum is there when you start out. Okay. And Mark, of course, Microsoft is a cloud provider, and I'm presuming you have your FedRAMP. You're one of the, I guess there's a half a dozen, or there's more now.
Yes.
It's sort of ramping up, so to speak. No pun intended. What is required of, what are the characteristics of cloud facilities that are able to attain FedRAMP?
From a provisional JAB perspective, it's a very taxing process. We have to produce a great amount of documentation and very special templates, go through a series of testing, and then go through review cycles with the government. Inevitably, that results in more work that has to be done. It'll be much easier once we move to continuous authorization, because the documentation, by the time you get it approved, well, a cloud service has changed. So continuous would allow us to innovate and rapidly develop while still delivering the security controls that are required.
And do they come back and recheck from time to time?
Yes, you have to do an annual assessment has to be done.
Okay.
And then, there are some issues with cloud providers. Microsoft has multiple cloud services that we offer, but because of how FedRAMP is staffed, we can't consume all of the JAB to do our services. So the competition has to be allowed as well. But that means our services are slowly getting through and not at the rate that we need.
Okay, and before we move on, I neglected to ask Melinda and Gary where you stand in your cloud implementation. What's the most edgy, if you will, application or use at Justice right now in clouds?
In terms of our cloud providers, cloud services, we have primarily, I would say, low, what we consider FIPS categorization, low systems out in the cloud. What I mean by that is if the system were to go down, it's not a major impact to our mission. I'll give you an example. We're aggressively looking at taking our learning management system out to a cloud service provider. It is not core to our mission, although it is important to make sure everybody is properly trained, but we don't need to be investing in that technical expertise in-house. That's something we should be outsourcing easily, and that's something we're moving out to the cloud. We do have a couple of moderate level systems that are also out in the cloud, but it's a little bit of a blend between private cloud versus government cloud. So we're taking this one step at a time.
Okay, and how about at Postal IG?
We're very much in the same boat. We've got a couple of very low project management, learning management kind of things that are out in the cloud. We had actually started in that path of looking at one of our major systems, our case management system. But because of some of the very specialized kind of requirements, when you started talking to the cloud providers, they kind of threw their hands up and said, we're a little nervous about trying to go down that path. So we decided to keep that in-house because it was one of those things that even with FedRAMP, it was just because of all the extra requirements you were going to place on a provider, it just seemed a little bit safer to keep that in-house.
All right, so then people are using a combination of government clouds and private clouds for a growing variety of purposes. So the question becomes next about brokering. I want to ask you about brokering. Right now you are self-brokering, in effect, by picking cloud by cloud. Can you envision how, from a security standpoint, especially our main focus today, how brokering could support your security needs, but maybe take away some of the burden you have right now? Is it possible? Is it doable? And what would you like to see from a process like that?
So, brokerage is certainly possible, but it is certainly a hunt for that magical unicorn in many ways, and here's why. We're taking the trust and the innate mission knowledge of the organization and trying to instill that in a group that may be contracted out, it may be in-house, whatever the case may be, and trust that they have enough knowledge of our mission and the impact that our data has to make good choices on cloud providers that they're going to bring in, or in some cases bundle or aggregate to meet our mission. So, from the agency perspective, especially as a information security officer perspective, what that means is that I now not only have to worry about the cloud provider, I now have to worry about this intermediary, and do I trust them to fully execute my position for risk for the organization? And that's really tough, because that's an institutional knowledge issue. An organization's appetite for risk is very much linked to its leadership and its mission. And the question is, does that broker have that knowledge, and can they execute with cloud providers at the right risk level? And I think that's really what's going to drive a successful cloud brokerage, is whether or not they can understand that risk and understand those thresholds.
Sure. Melinda, you're content to be your own broker for a while, or are you looking at the possibility of brokerage on behalf of DOJ later on?
Certainly, I think brokerage, that's an evolving area that we would like to take advantage of. I don't know if we're necessarily there yet today. So, for example, as Steve mentioned, I mean, it's knowing the broker has to know what our mission needs are and be able to advocate for us, right? So is the broker ultimately supposed to advocate for the agency, or are they advocating potentially for the cloud service provider? So I think that is still sorting itself out. Right now, we are very much similar to HHS. We're pursuing various cloud deployments as they best fit our mission and our financial needs in terms of outsourcing. But otherwise, I think there's opportunities for growth in the brokerage area, and we want to support that as much as we can. I just don't think we're there yet today.
It's almost like real estate. You wonder if that agent's on your side or the seller's side.
Right, exactly.
And when push comes to shove, they let you know, I guess, whose side they're on. Gary, what's your perspective on the brokerage question?
No, I'd say the same thing. I mean, and you really got to worry about, like Stephen mentioned, that institutional knowledge and how much of that can you impart on a third party, to ensure that they're operating to your benefit and in the trust that you need to gain from them, so that you can trust what they're telling you. And kind of, with the analogy of the real estate agent, at the end of the day, if you're relying on a third party, at the end of the day, that real estate agent is making sure that they get the best price that they get, regardless of who buys or sells the house. And that's something to worry about, is if you're relying on a third party that, their income, their profit margin is based on, maybe it's the number of times that they brokerage something. Maybe it's not necessarily the best brokerage, but the volume of brokerage. All those things are going to really make it difficult to just wholesale hand that responsibility over to a third party. I think maybe at some point we'll get there, but I don't know that it's going to come anytime soon, to be honest with you.
Well, from government lips, that means a long time off, if you read between the lines. And Mark, I wanted to ask you how brokerage looks from the vendor standpoint. And the reason I ask, in Microsoft's particular case, the company has it's been in the government since the dawn of computing as we know it today. Some of your large competitors, not so much, but they are large. And so they have brand recognition. You all have brand recognition. You all have pretty robust marketing. But that's not true of all cloud providers. So who would want to be behind a broker if you've got the capabilities of a Microsoft or some of your bigger competitors?
We work directly with the customer or the broker, however the customer prefers to move forward. In the cases where we have a broker in place, it hasn't changed our relationship with the customer. We still have the same accountabilities and responsibilities to the customer that we would have if the broker was not there. So for us, we're indifferent to the process.
Okay, so you're confident that a broker is not going to say, well, if they, do you look to see if they're getting the same incentives from all the companies they might represent?
We would not, but what we would do is put our best foot forward. We actually offer a suite of services that complement our on-premise software as well. Mm-hmm. So we can give an end-to-end solution in all situations.
Okay, well, I want to move on to the topic of visibility into the cloud, because I think that's the next kind of frontier people need to think about, because there are so many different variations on scenarios of cloud computing. So, Mark, I want to ask you first, what do customers want in terms of visibility into what's going on in the infrastructure you provide, and how does that vary? I mean, you could be providing, a cloud provider could be bare metal, it could be applications online, and everything in between.
Yes, pretty much they want full, unfettered access to everything as a general rule. And as a service provider and a multi-tenant environment, of course, we have to draw a line somewhere, what we can provide customers, what we cannot, because there is some confidential data in there as well. So with each customer, we've gone through a process where now we're standardizing across each one of the services every release, we're trying to give more and more access to data that is relevant to your use of the service and your security data. We've gotten very far with the Azure platform because you can now monitor your instance of service directly using System Center or any other tool. And Office 365, our collaboration suite, is now also offering a lot of opportunities to extract data that are security relevant.
So that would be like monitoring data, that kind of
Yes.
thing, or incident data?
Yes.
So what you're seeing as operating a data center, essentially, then the customer can see the same information?
Not the same information, but relatively close.
And how does that get delivered? I mean, is it something that they...
Your customer can pull it. It's online. It's actual. There are APIs that they can hit to, or they can actually pull the content directly.
All right, and Melinda, we're coming to a break, but quickly, what is your way of looking at what's going on inside cloud providers?
Transparency is key. Transparency on cost. How much are we paying? What kind of value are we getting? What kind of services are we getting? And ultimately, the safeguarding procedures that are in place. And I know Mark just mentioned IR, so having visibility into the incident response or incident chain is going to be critical for government agencies because it may be innocuous for a commercial provider, but it may be relevant to a government agency that will help us connect the dots in other ways.
Okay, we're going to explore that question a little bit more. We're going to take a short break right now. Our guests today are Mark Williams, the Chief Security Officer for Microsoft Federal, Steve Hernandez, the Chief Information Security Officer for the Health and Human Services Inspector General, Melinda Rogers is Chief Information Security Officer at Justice Department, and Gary Bartlett, the Chief Information Officer at the Postal Service Office of Inspector General. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. This is Reducing Risk in the Cloud for Government, sponsored by Microsoft, here on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.